We're here today with the New York Foundation. Both George and Ricke have agreed to volunteer some of their time to share some insights into their work, into their background, and even into some of the direction that they want to take with some of their strategies. So I'm really excited to hear a lot more and share with all of us some of your experiences and where you think we can all take some key learnings and actually implement some of your ideas ourselves. So, first of all, I would like to just take a second to introduce both of you. Could just take a minute to share a bit about yourself and your responsibilities at the New York Foundation.
Great. Thanks, Kim. It's good to be in conversation with you, and of course, always happy to participate with George in any conversations as we reflect on our work. So my name is Ricke Mananzala. My current role with the New York Foundation is as executive director. I started about a year and a half ago, but my history with the foundation dates back about 20 years, a little bit more. I think the thing I'm most proud of in my relationship with the foundation is as a former grantee. Being a grant recipient of the foundation, I think, gives me a lot of insights for then, what it's like to experience being a grassroots organizer and a person fundraising from this challenging world of philanthropy. To know what that's like and use that experience in my leadership role at the foundation, I think is really invaluable. I was also a previous trustee with George before stepping into this role. I'm just super honored to be a part of a foundation's history that has supported so much grassroots organizing and cutting edge movement building in the city for over 100 years. So I'm really, really proud to be in the role and to get to work with George. What about you, George? What's your story with the foundation?
Thanks, Ricke and Kim. Great to be in community with you. Yeah, George Suttles. In my day job, I work in the asset management space with nonprofit institutional investors. So I'm really excited to be talking about sort of this investment management journey that we're on, especially around values alignment in that regard. Been on the New York Foundation board for a few years now. I came in sort of initially on the investment committee and then was assistant treasurer and supported my predecessor, who was the investment committee chair at the time. And then I want to say right around the time Ricke was installed as our new ED, I also was coming in as investment committee chair and treasurer. And so that presented a unique opportunity under Ricke's leadership to examine sort of how we think about all the levers that we can pull for social change and the equity work and organizing work that we're doing. And so, Ricke and I looked at each other and said, hey, here's an exciting opportunity to take our equity lens and apply it to our investment portfolio. And so, for the last year plus, we've really been on this exciting journey. More work to do, but I feel really good about sort of where we're headed. It's a space where sort of more attention is being focused on, right? Because typically when you think about a foundation, you think about the grant making work and the convening work, but what about, aligning values in terms of investments? And so we're excited to sort of have, be doing that work. So.
Great. Thank you both for sharing a little bit of your background. It sounds like you've had quite a lot of experience with the foundation, and perhaps some people out there don't know, or that are reading or watching these videos don't know what the foundation actually does. Maybe you could just highlight really briefly when did the foundation start? What's the size or mission, or maybe some key themes, and then you maybe highlight a little bit about some of the grants and investment work that you do, just to give us an overview first of the foundation.
Sure. Yeah, I think I alluded to this in my introduction. I was supported by the foundation as a former organizer. We currently support in New York City is grassroots organizing and movement building for racial, economic, gender, and climate justice. But the history of the foundation dates back to 1909. So like I said, we're almost close to 120 years old, if you're doing the math, and have a legacy of supporting a lot of community-based local work. I started off among a number of issues, but especially in the early days around medical research, youth development work. It evolved into then also supporting civil rights work, both in the city and also in the South during the civil rights movement, which was an interesting period in the foundation's history. But by and large, the foundation has been committed to supporting local work and especially community organizing for over 100 years. And right now, a big part of our focus is supporting groups that have been historically overlooked and under-resourced by philanthropy. So that is especially BIPOC-led organizations, trans-led organizations, and startup groups. We're often the first funder in to a lot of organizations when they're just getting started in their communities with this great idea, there's a problem to solve, we want to bring our communities together, and we want to form an organization to do that work. We're really proud to be that first funder and many of the institutions that are now these very strong organizations working both in their neighborhoods, but also citywide and even statewide, were first funded by the New York Foundation decades ago. And so we see that as a very big part of our role in advancing our mission. And I think, as George has alluded to also, our ability as a foundation to be a grant maker is one thing we do, but that's such a small portion of the resources that we're putting out into communities. And so you ask about our foundation size, I think you're referring to our endowment in some cases. And so it's all relative, right? So to me, it feels small. That's actually big, but I guess relative to other private foundations, we're relatively small, again, place-based foundation. And our endowment has ranged in size between 40 million to 100 million, but we're on average about a $60 million endowment. And under George's leadership and other investment committee members and foundation staff, we've really been examining more recently, as George said, how can we, deploy all of our capital, not just our grant making, in alignment with our mission and values. And so maybe, George, you want to say a little bit about the history of how we got to this point and thinking about, how to use our endowment to further our mission.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ricke. And I think it's important, and Ricke alluded to this, I think it's important to also sort of acknowledge the fact that, there's a ton of leadership sort of within and around the foundation. And so, this isn't something that Ricke and I woke up one day and said, hey, this has to happen. We actually took the work of others who really cared about this and said, well, how do we sort of carry this, a few steps further? So that's important to acknowledge. And so what our investment committee started to do is say, hey, is there an opportunity to form some impact subcommittee and begin to explore opportunities to leverage the other 95% of our endowment for good in a values aligned way? And so we started doing that work and, quickly realized that, New York Foundation prides itself on partnership and having the right partners and being community-based and place-based. And we said, well, same thing is true for our investment strategy. We need a partner that understands social justice oriented values alignment investment strategies in a way where we can actually look to them for leadership. We shouldn't be trying to cobble together values aligned strategies as a committee on the side of our desk. And so, that actually was the first step in our process, was to say, hey, we should put out an RFP and try to see what other types of investment management partnerships or asset management partnerships are out there. And so, I'm grateful to Ricke and to the staff and to, my fellow investment committee members, and sort of saying, yeah, that's right. We shouldn't be cobbling together strategies as a group of volunteers, on this investment committee. We really should try to find, the right partners who can help us do this work. And so, that was sort of the first transformative aha moment that we had from a process standpoint. So I think the concept was real for us. We need, values aligned investment strategies, but the first real step for us was, we now need to identify a partner. So.
That's great. Thank you both for sharing some highlights. And I have a couple of questions I might just combine. You've already alluded to and started to explain many of the things that you've transitioned from, not only issues, being very cutting edge in the issues and the problems you're trying to tackle, but also the way you're trying to do it, right? They'll go through grant making and investment processes. So maybe just as a combined two-part question, do you feel you are or will be cutting edge in both your grant making, the history of the foundation, and the investment side? And then do you get pushback? I mean, you're tackling very serious issues, very systematic problems, and as well trying to do so in an innovative way that you have not been doing before. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Maybe I'll take that first one, George, and you can take the second part on has there been pushback. So I think first, I wouldn't necessarily call our work cutting edge. Even though we've been doing grant making for a long time, and perhaps doing some things before other funders were doing that, like funding startup groups or this hopefully is not seen as cutting edge, but still is, like providing multi-year general operating support and trusting groups, that's something that we've been doing for a long time, that more funders are beginning to pursue as their standard practice. That's great. I wouldn't necessarily call it cutting edge, but yeah, there were some things we were doing before other foundations were doing when it came to our grant making. But we are definitely not necessarily cutting edge in where we're at with how we are thinking about our investments, the same way that we're thinking about our grant making. And I think George actually captures this really well when he tells our story. He says, look, like we have been given the benefit of the doubt that because our grant making looks the way it does and how we are very explicit about racial justice in particular, that we're the first funder in for startup groups that are often marginalized from philanthropy, we just assumed that our investments and our process and our values around our investing process were just like our grant making. And we were given the benefit of the doubt. And it's not. It's really important for us to be honest about that and to share that we're learning from other foundations that have been doing this a lot longer than us, and take inspiration from our peers today and who helped us along in this process that we're talking to you about today, like Jesse Smith Noyes, like General Services, like Nathan Cummings, and so many other foundations that have been leading on this work a lot longer than us. So I think we're entering in with a lot of humility. And yeah, we want to shake some things up. We want to learn from what folks are doing. We want to chart some new paths on our own, which we're excited to talk a little bit about today, but we're very early phase in this process. And a lot of that actually has to do with building alignment internally, as George had said, with the board and staff, with the groups we support, and of course, with a partner like CCA, which we'll talk about their integral role to help get us to this point. But I'll turn to George because he actually helped, and we worked together to initiate this process with the board and staff over more than just the past couple of years. And George, I don't know if we'd say there was pushback, but there's definitely a lot of alignment building, and you helped to lead a lot of that. So how'd that go? What'd you think?
How'd that go? Yeah, I just want to underscore one of the very important points that Ricke lifted up, is that benefit of the doubt piece, right? Is that sort of in the field, New York Foundation was seen as social justice oriented, very progressive, very sort of community minded in the way we partnered with our grantees, and very vocal about the issues that they cared about. And so people were saying, oh, well, of course, the New York Foundation is also equally as values aligned in their investments, because we were values aligned in our operations as well as in our grant making. And so, to understand that disconnect, to understand that for, many, many years we were getting that benefit of the doubt, it felt imperative that we honor people's perceptions of us, because they were positive and they were progressive. And we were like, what, right, we have to do this work because it is expected of us, and to sort of continue to reap the benefit of the doubt in a positive way felt disingenuous. So we were like, okay, we really cared about, our integrity in that regard. So we were like, this is important work that we have to embark on. So I just wanted to sort of double down on Ricky's good point around that. And, this values aligned work fit into questions around, spend down or perpetuity. And so there was a lot of myth busting we needed to do to get to a shared understanding about sort of the type of work we were going to embark on. So I wouldn't say there was pushback, but there were a lot of questions like, oh, well, if we do values aligned, we're going to concede returns, and then we're going to have to spend down and we won't exist anymore. And, and grantees were saying, oh, we want you to exist forever. You're usually our first funder, and, the field needs you. There was a lot of just questions to ask and answer and grapple with together to get to a really good place for, our community to say, right, this makes a lot of sense. This is fundamentally who we are. There has to be values alignment, and values alignment can also support perpetuity. So, we just had to make sure that everyone understood why we were approaching this the way we were approaching it, why the time was now to approach it the way we were approaching it, and that, there were both propositions to be had, and that we didn't have to make these urgent binary decisions like, well, if you do values alignment, you're going to have to spend down. It was like, no, we're going to do values alignment in a thoughtful, stepwise way that will also lend itself to perpetuity and values alignment. So a lot of work in that regard. And we've got a great board, great staff, great community of grantees and leaders, and a great investment committee that said, yep, let's focus on answering these questions together in a satisfactory manner on purpose to get to a values alignment strategy. And so I just really appreciate sort of everyone in our community for, sort of supporting that effort and being all hands on deck. So.
Great. Thank you both for those insights. And it sounds like there was a lot of, okay, you don't want to say pushback, but a lot of dialogue and probably a lot of people that had their opinions and you weren't maybe even sure yourself on the direction immediately until you had those discussions. And you mentioned working with other folks outside of the New York Foundation to get advice or to get support or help or guidance. And I think you mentioned CCA and Bert Fuss as one of those that you worked with. So maybe you could just briefly tell us your engagement with Bert Fuss and CCA, and why did you decide to seek outside help with the work and your objectives that you were trying to achieve?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the thing that George and I often laugh about, and I think it's important to share publicly, is we thought we were going to lead the RFP search process on our own, right? We
Mhm.
knew we could hire someone to help us identify a new investment advisor. We had some tools to do that on our own, and we thought, of course, we could do this. But we got great advice from one of our colleagues, Dimple up in Chandani from the General Services Foundation at the time. It was like, you should hire somebody. And here's why. You want to be able to participate in the process. Your role is to provide leadership, insights, but not necessarily to be the coordinator of the process. It's just going to make it so much smoother for you. And it's also going to ensure that you can really engage in the process rather than just the logistics and the other challenging aspects of, as you know, searching for an investment advisor. So that's where community capital advisors came in our partnership with Bert and Mark, why that was so integral. As George said, a lot of their roles, not just, hey, how do you execute the steps of a search? Of course it was that, but is setting up a process that helps us first build alignment and clarity among all the stakeholders, the investment committee, but also the staff. And then getting clear through that process, then what is going to be, the content in the RFP? How are we going to identify prospective advisors to interview, and then feel good about our decision-making process? And I think, of course, the outcome was important, that we have a fantastic new investment partner who we'll talk about and unveil in a moment. But more than anything, like George said, in part, we didn't have that much pushback because the process, right, for how we built alignment through the RFP led us to a really great outcome, and where everyone felt on board. There might have been questions, but I wouldn't say significant pushback to this significant shift for the foundation. And just like we're thinking about, our grant making being more transparent, how we're thinking about all of those aspects of our operation being strong. This is like our opportunity also to think about how our investments can feel more like our grant making. And so identifying both a partner like Bert and CCA and helping us identify the folks to get us to that point, I think it was also an opportunity to engage more than just the traditional players in that RFP process. And Bert was great at that. And I think maybe, George, you unveil who we're working with now, but our new investment partner is also absolutely on board with our new way of thinking, not just around our investments, but how we engage beyond the traditional players in the investment process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ricke. So before I unveil our new investment management partner, I also there is a point that I want to lift up that I think is important to highlight, is that when I think about our investment committee, and we're blessed to work with the group that we're working with, our investment committee is mostly POC, highly skilled investment, community organizing, and impact assessment professionals who brought their sensibilities, their skill set, and their expertise to this process. And so I don't know if, and there are private and community foundation investment committees that look like ours. And so what I would lift up is maybe they ought to look like ours.
Mm-hmm.
So just if I had to sort of be declarative in one part of my commentary, is that I'm just so proud of our investment committee because they have the skills, they have the competency, they have the expertise, and they have the shared understanding about where we need to move our work. And so, it's not just about their diversity, it's about the shared understanding about the purposeful work we're all engaged in together. And so that is really, really important to lift up, because without our investment committee under, sort of Ricky's leadership and sort of my sort of helping to sort of shape what we were trying to do with CCA and others, I don't know if we get to where we needed to get to, so I just wanted to lift that up. And so where we were able to get to, with that being said, is we're sort of super excited to announce that we've just engaged in a dynamic investment partnership with Vivian West Fuller, which is the joint venture between two Black-owned, Black-founded investment management firms that came together to offer OCIO services to nonprofit institutional investors. And so not only are they very much aligned from a value standpoint, but what we love about working with them is that they're savvy, sophisticated institutional investors. And they're in the trenches with us doing this work. So if you look at their board service and their volunteer and philanthropic efforts, both as a firm and as individuals who comprise the leadership of the firm, they get the kind of work that we're doing. And they have the investment chops and expertise to help us execute on values-aligned investment strategies. And so that's the type of leadership that we were looking for. And, with Bert and Mark's help, and, we were able to get to a really good place. So we're super excited.
That's great. So there was obviously a lot of thought to align in your mission and your DNA of your foundation to make sure that you have an investment committee and wealth advisors that work together in the way that fits your long-term investment strategy. So now that you have this new wealth advisor, how would you describe your new approach related to diversity in your investment committee and really with your funds overall? And maybe just mention, how does this focus on diversity fit in with the bigger picture now, where you are today and looking forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I would say our goal isn't diversity, right? And in terms of, the end point and what we're doing with our investments. I think we've talked about this before, that our goal is ultimately around racial equity. And to get there, we need to have an inclusive process where we're bringing more diverse voices into the decisions that we're making, into shaping our values, into doing the work both on the investments and the grant making side. As we said, we've been good about that from a grant making perspective. But yeah, like George said, we were very intentional about who we were including in the conversations, who the representation we have our investment committee, particularly around race and gender, from communities and individuals that have often been historically excluded from these access and opportunities and leadership on investment committees and beyond. So again, like, diversity wasn't the goal, it's racial equity. Inclusion is the process to get there. And then for us, then diversity, if you've done the inclusion part meaningfully, is just the reality as a fact. And I think that's why we've landed in such a good place, as George said, around having such a strong investment committee, folks that are aligned with our values, have the investment expertise, and understand mission-aligned investing. And that's why we're moving at a pace that maybe, I know some of my peers are like, wow, you're making such quick progress on these shifts from traditional investing to moving towards mission-aligned investing. How'd you do that? And I think we can largely thank, again, George's leadership of investment committee members, but the process, again, through the RFP that we did with CCA and building that alignment. I think it's really important, to note that what we're doing around our shifting our investments, values, and practice is a part of a larger project that the organization has been undertaking for a couple years now, where this shift that we're making isn't a standalone project. This is a part of what we're calling our broader intersectional racial equity work, where everyone across the foundation, staff and board, all the committees from governance perspective, from operations to grant making, grants management and beyond, everyone set goals around how could we further align the foundation's actions with our values. And so I'll spare you the boring details of our racial equity dashboard, but everyone's tracking, right. So, okay, the investment committee had a goal around finding new leadership and a new investment partner to help align our assets with our mission and values. But other committees are having similar conversations and making similar moves around how we're doing board recruitment. How we got all those great investment committee members is largely connected to this broader process. So knowing that these weren't standalone things, similarly with our grant making, being more explicit about supporting Black-led, trans-led, and startup organizations, which we have done, but we're being more explicit about it. All of this was a part of a broader organizational plan. And so that everyone knew, whether you were a staff member or a board member, that you had a role and a function and a leadership position to play in advancing whatever position you were in. And right now we're talking about the investment committee and our investments, but just know everyone is busy at the foundation constantly asking themselves this question, that racial equity isn't a thing we do, it's how we do all things.
I would just say amen. That's it. I would just say amen. All the things. If I had my church fan, I would be fanning myself down, because Ricke definitely delivered a word. So yeah.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. I wish we could end on a note like that, or maybe we still can, no? But that was amazingly said. So you've mentioned inclusion, diversity, transparency. You've actually provided some insights into really concrete action steps, including just communication and getting everybody involved, having it go across the entire foundation and not only the leadership. Going forward, what are some investment themes or key initiatives that you are most excited about? Where we're going now? What's next?
What are you excited about, George?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for us, we had already explored some of the low-hanging fruit, like, ESG and other screens to do no harm, but we want to go beyond that. We really want to look into sort of proactive investments and solutions, around, racial, economic, gender, and climate justice in New York City and beyond. So we think it's important, we don't want to screen out bad actors. We want to proactively be an economic, engine in the city, and leverage all of the lenses and perspectives that we have around racial, economic, gender, climate justice, all the things, right? We've got resources to strategically deploy. And so we want to do that, across asset classes if possible. We approach this with humility. And so there are, frameworks for us to access that we think can be helpful. I think of the, Justice Funders, Just Transitions Investment Framework, and the Center for Economic Democracy's Social Movement Investing Framework. And so, we hope to be a leader in this space one day, but right now we're just following and connecting with some of the great work that's already been advanced, and we want to be doing that great work as well. And so there are frameworks and approaches and investment opportunities that we want to explore, to get us there. I also think one of the things that we're doing that's super exciting is sort of reevaluating our investment policy statement, because we understand that that's the premier governing document that's going to codify a lot of this work, especially from a process and methodological standpoint. And so, we want somebody to pick up our IPS and say, wow, like, this is what the New York Foundation is about from an investment management standpoint. And so, we're embarking on that work. One of the steps that we're going to take to move this work forward and advance it. So that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited about the policy work, leveraging the IPS, and I'm also excited, about proactively being a racial and economic, gender, climate justice investor, and thinking about those opportunities across asset classes. So.
Yeah, and one of the things that George has brought up in trying to be different, just like the way we're trying to be more transparent about our grant making, where our dollars are going, and saying, hey, if we made these commitments around supporting Black-led, trans-led, and startup groups, let's say how we've been doing on that. We're just about to release our 2022 year in review and said, if those were goals, how did we do? I love how George is like, well, we should be doing that on the investment side too. So when we're getting from a place from transitioning our investments from more traditional, outlets to, again, more community aligned and values aligned investments, George has a great idea. Like, why don't we create a similar transparency report for our stakeholders, not just internally, but externally when we're making those shifts, what that looks like, what the process is. And this question, like when George brought up those frameworks before, the things that we're learning from that I'm especially excited about is not just the kind of starting points around ESG negative and positive screens. We'll do that. We'll learn from that. I'm still new in this space. But the thing that gets me the most excited is that point George made, I think is a foundational value for us, is how do we align all of our resources in alignment, not just with our values, but from what organizers, movements, and communities are saying. They're in this space more. So those frameworks, the Just Transitions framework from Justice Funders and the Center for Economic Democracy Social Movement Investing framework, this is the cutting edge stuff, Kim. Like, this is the stuff I think most folks aren't touching yet in the foundation world, because it is new, because it is challenging some of the status quo, because it is challenging the logic of investing from extractive economies to regenerative economies. That's the stuff that gets me excited. I think will be tremendously difficult for us to understand, unpack, and then put into action. But that means that it's worth trying, because I think that's the foundation's ethos. And then the bigger picture of all that excites me is that it's about power. It's when we think about power in communities, we're supporting community organizing. I think we need to be thinking about our investments in that way too, that our broader hope as a foundation is that we're playing our role in shifting power from philanthropy to the grassroots. But we need to recognize first that we wield a lot of power with the resources that we have, and how can we be constantly interrogating that and thinking about steps to shift power. And I think the way we think about our investments in alignment with movements is such an exciting place to start, but it will be challenging, and it should be, but doesn't mean that it's not worth trying. So I'm ready to jump in. I know that the foundation is so exciting.
Yeah. And one more thing I wanted to just share is that, and we talked about this at the front of our time together, is that there will be that alignment. We won't have to lean on the benefit of the doubt anymore. So when people talk about the New York Foundation and our investment portfolio and our strategies, they'll be like, right, like they want to try the hard things because that's what we're known for on the grant making and ops side. Like they'll be like, yep, this now all makes sense to us. And so, I think at the end of the day, as Ricke as a leader in this space, and as me serving on the board as a steward of these resources in support of our grantees and in partnership with Ricke and the staff, is we want everything that we're doing to make sense to the people we care most about, and that communities that have traditionally been excluded and individuals whose agency has been taken away, and we're just trying to help them activate their power. And so that's what's really exciting, just from a very emotional standpoint, is that it'll all make sense to people now. Everything will be aligned, everything that we're doing will make sense. So that feels really good, to not need to lean on the benefit of the doubt anymore, but to say, yep, that the investments are exactly where you would expect them to be from the New York Foundation. So
that's great. And I'm listening to you, and we just have a very short time together, but everything you say seems so logical. It makes sense. It seems so straightforward. It seems so easy to implement, but I'm sure that if you look back and reflect, it hasn't always been easy work. It hasn't always been as straightforward or clear cut as you maybe are looking at it now. Could you share, maybe one or two of the biggest challenges that you had, and really to give us some ending final advice for other foundations that are looking to either change up their investment community or their investing strategy? Anything you want to share for final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I like ending that way too, because I think it's another opportunity to remind anyone that happens to be reading or watching, is that we don't have all the answers. We didn't have all the answers. And the main piece of advice was that you shouldn't go at this alone, I think, or wait for your investment committee or whatever governing body that's responsible for taking these steps and making these decisions to be all on the same page and all ready to go. And so I think that's why we chose to work with CCA, as we said, that we needed some help, that we needed to rely on their leadership, facilitation, experience, and relationships, but that we also really leaned on our peers to say, hey, we know you've been further along in this journey. What challenges did you face? And that really set us up for such a good process. As George said, we didn't have a lot of pushback. We had a lot of alignment already in many ways from our investment committee and staff and board as a whole, but we wouldn't have gotten to where we got this quickly if it weren't for the help that we got from CCA and also from our peers, again, like General Services Foundation, Jesse Smith Noyes, among others. And I'm a part of a CEO peer group where I am doing this learning. This is still very new to me. So it's important that I know that I don't have to have all the answers, that I have the right intentions. I think I have the right values and the right goals in this process, but my lack of experience and expertise is something that I'm open about. I think that also makes me ask questions that I'm not afraid to ask as a maybe kind of basic or straightforward question that most people have the answer to, because I think it challenges a lot of our assumptions about why things are the way they are, why they're being done certain ways in the investment space. And I think there's so much to explore, as we've already talked about, for how to think about what is called it means so many things when you hear impact investing, mission-aligned investing, values-aligned investing. What does that actually mean? And can we chart new paths in this work? I think there's plenty of space for experimentation. And so I would say for anyone that's new to this work, one, don't do it alone. Get help, right? If you're doing using the RFP process as a way to explore new directions. Two, don't assume that everyone's got to be fully on board or all in the same place to even start that conversation. In fact, I think use the process to build alignment as we did. It really, really worked. And then three, challenge orthodoxy, right? Things don't have to look the way they have looked before. In fact, if you're engaging in this work, it means you're looking for something new and different and, getting your foundation into new directions. And so I think challenging kind of that status quo thinking, I think, is one thing that's been really big for us.
Great. So don't do it alone, build alignment, and challenge the status quo. 3 key tips and takeaways from this process. George had to step off. Thank you both for your time, your insights today. most importantly, all of the great work that you're doing in building these missions and building new approaches to break the status quo, as you said, and to move forward in the right direction. And hopefully we can all take that key learning of just taking that step one by one, asking questions, building alignment, seeking outside help and support, and just really moving forward in a way that just, as George said, makes sense, right? So do you
That's
have any final comment to add to that?
No, thanks, Kim, and just a lot of gratitude to Bert and Mark from CCA for their support and leadership over this. It took us about a year to land this, and they were really integral for that. And so that part of the process is done. Now the exciting work with Vivian West Fuller begins, and so we're so happy to be jumping in, experimenting with them, and shifting and shaking things up.
I'm personally very grateful to be aligned in a community with all of you, and I look forward to the great work and surely the great work that you're going to do in the future. So thank you again for your time and wishing you a wonderful day.
Likewise. Thanks, Kim.